Welcome everyone to our kickoff meeting for the project. Um, and so the project actually got started officially back in April. And for a while, we were hoping that we would be able to run a live in-person kickoff meeting. But at some point, it became clear that that was not going to happen in a bit. And so the good thing is that now people all over the world can come and join us at our virtual kickoff meeting. And so I want to open by giving a little bit of background about the project and where we're coming from. So the title of the project is Understanding the World Through Code. And we have a great team of people who came together originally to put together these proposal, and I think you will see all of us over the next couple of days, and some of us trickling in and out of the video. I also want to point out that since we submitted the proposal and we started working on this, we also acquired two more proto PIs who have been collaborating with us fully in this project as PIs, even though they were not in the original proposal. But Chris Burge and Josh Tenenbaum have been really crucial and central to this project and to this effort. And so, before I tell you a little bit more about what the project is about, so the motivation for the project was that we saw, on the one hand, deep learning really transforming science and transforming many different areas of science. For example, even within the PIs of our group, for example, Wengong Jin is actually going to be telling us more about this effort tomorrow. But this was a project that got started with him and our co-PIs, Regina Barzilai and Tommy Jakulak, where they were looking at making predictions about organic reactions, right? And already very early on, they were able to achieve a level of accuracy that was significantly higher than what was achieved by prior techniques when it came to making these predictions. And they have been able to move on this research at really breakneck speed, to the point where a few months ago, in collaboration with James Collins and Jonathan Michael Stokes, for example, at the Broad Institute, they were actually able to demonstrate a structurally new antibiotic. You might have heard about this in the news, but it's just a little piece of evidence of the kind of very powerful advances that deep learning is making possible in many different areas of scientific exploration. However, there was also a sense that when it came to applying deep learning by itself, something is missing, right? And in particular, when it comes to really building up our scientific understanding of natural processes, for example, interpretability is really crucial, right? It's not enough for the neural network to be able to understand a process. We want to be able to understand that process. And not only that, there's many domains in science where data is plentiful, abundant, where we are drowning in data, and the kind of possibilities that you have with deep learning to learn from very large amounts of data make a lot of sense. But there are other settings where collecting data is actually expensive, and where we would really like to be able to bring in more domain knowledge, more of our prior knowledge about some of these underlying processes, in order to be able to learn with more data efficiency. And this question of prior knowledge is really crucial when it comes to scientific understanding. It's not enough to be able to get a ton of data and train a network and hope that it's able to predict what you want. You want to make sure that the predictions it makes are consistent with what we know about the underlying processes behind many of these phenomena. And finally, being able to distinguish between correlation and causation, being able to tease out between things that are just coincidentally correlated versus things that are really having a causal effect. And so there was a sense that something more was needed. There was a sense among our group that something more was needed. And so based on our background, we're also intimately familiar with another arguably quieter transformation that has been taking place in computer science over the last couple of decades. So everyone these days is familiar with the way deep learning has transformed machine learning, and not just machine learning, but really many areas of computer science. But it turns out that formal method has been going through its own quieter revolution, where today we are able to reason about systems, reason logically about systems at a scale that was unthinkable 1 or 2 decades ago. And techniques to reason formally about code, for example, have moved from lab curiosities to commercial products that are out there discovering bugs in software that is used day in and day out. And this ability to reason formally at scale is something that has been very well exploited in the world of software. But one of the motivations for this project was that we could potentially leverage more of these for the purpose of scientific understanding. And in particular, we wanted to build on the success of a previous expeditions project, the ESCAPE project, which really pushed program synthesis forward in terms of the scale of problems that it's able to tackle and the variety of domains that it's able to work with. So at a very high level, the high-level idea behind program synthesis is that you can combine together behavioral constraints, for constraints on how you want a particular piece of code to run, with structural constraints about how you want a particular piece of code to look like. And by bringing them together and reasoning about the combination of these constraints, you can produce a piece of code that satisfies both of these kinds of constraints, right? And so these kind of techniques have demonstrated to be very, very effective in a variety of domains, from data structure manipulations to data wrangling. For example, one of the success stories in this style of synthesis is the flash fill technology that is part of Excel that allows you to demonstrate string manipulations with often 1 or 2 examples, and is able to learn small programs to do that based on that information. Now, very early on in the research that was pushed forward, even through the ESCAPE project, it was observed that there was some potential for these kind of technology to be useful for scientific discovery as well. After all, the observation is that a lot of scientific knowledge nowadays is actually encoded in the form of source code, right? Scientists used programs to write models for a variety of phenomena today, right? And programs have many benefits. First, executability. The consequences of theories can actually be evaluated in silico through virtual experiments. You can also do interventions. You can modify the code and evaluate different alternative scenarios within the code. And if the code is written properly, what you expect to have is some modularity, that different parts of the code represent meaningful parts of a system. It enables probing at a level that is sometimes difficult to probe in the real world, right? And finally, interpretability, right? Code can be audited to ensure its consistency with our understanding of the theory that it is meant to represent. Now, one of the very early efforts in actually taking advantage of program synthesis in order to aid with scientific discovery was actually done almost 9 years ago, or almost 7 years ago, in the lab of Raz Bodic, my own advisor. There was this effort led by Ali Koskal, that was looking at whether you could leverage program synthesis to discover the mechanisms within the cell of a C. elegans worm that was used for deciding the fates of different cells as this worm develops. And one of the key observations was that you could model regulatory networks with programs, right? The kind of messages that are sent from one cell to the other could be modeled by modeling suppression and activation networks, and you could model some of those with state machines. Moreover, the advantage of leveraging program synthesis to go from data about these interactions to a model that actually describes these interactions is that you could potentially go to a synthesizer and say, here's some data, generate me a model that is consistent with the data. And then you could also say, okay, and now can you generate me a different model that is also consistent with the data? And so, for example, in one model, there might be a step that is being inhibited in one way, and in another model, it's inhibited in a different way, right? And the synthesizer can now tell you that both of these are fully consistent with the data that you have available, and these alternatives that are all consistent with the data can now give rise to new experiments. So this work was really inspirational in terms of the ability of program synthesis to discover models of natural processes that could then potentially be validated against further experimentation. We ourselves, for example, in collaboration with Josh Tenenbaum and Tim O'Donnell in a project led by Kevin Ellis, we have actually also been looking at different kinds of models of a different kind of natural phenomena. In this case, we're talking about language, right? So, for example, in linguistics, people have developed extensive formalisms to describe the mechanics of language, the way words come together and the way words are altered and modified to form different forms of words. So, for example, if I tell you that I have a root of a word called open and that I want the past tense, you can derive that the past tense of open is opened. Right? Now, in this case, it's actually quite simple once you get past the funny characters that are often used to describe phonemes in this literature. But sometimes it gets a little bit more complicated. For example, if you look at the word walked, right? So you would think, based on a rule that says, well, you take the word and you add d, you would think that the past tense for walk should actually be walked. But unless you're learning English as a second language, you know that it's not walked, it's walked. Right? Now, why is that? Well, it's because there is another rule in the language, a phonological rule that tells you that whenever you have this KD sound at the end, it should really be transformed to a KT sound. That's why we say walked and not walked. So the challenge was, could you actually discover the mechanics of how essentially words are put together from a corpus? Could you leverage program synthesis in order to help you discover these rules. So the high-level idea is that from a corpus in a language that combines a particular form of different words together with some meaning information, can you reconstruct from that both a set of morphology rules as well as the stems of those original words that, through the application of those morphology rules, led to the observed and led to the observations, right? And so this is an instance where, again, you're taking data from the natural world. In this case, it's data that was recorded from native speakers of a language, and you are combining that data with prior knowledge of linguistics encoded in a program synthesizer in order to give you a theory for how a particular language works in the form of a set of rules. And so what we found is that you can actually come up with some fairly intricate rules. I don't expect you to decipher everything that is in this slide because the notation would take a little too long to explain. But the bottom line is that you can take a language like Somali and take a collection of words, and from those words come up with a set of rules, both morphology and phonology rules, for how these words are put together. And then from those rules, backward derive the stems and the sequence of transformations that that word goes through in order to get to the final form that was actually observed and recorded from the data. And in the aggregate, what we can see is that for many languages, you can actually do this quite effectively. So what you see in this plot is on the order of, I believe it was 75 different languages, and comparing different variations of the method. The most important line to notice is the strong blue line that shows that for many of these languages, you can actually reconstruct 100% of the target rules based on an observed corpus. So these tantalizing results would seem to suggest that what we really need is program synthesis, right? That program synthesis is really going to help us push forward. However, if the problem was already solved, there wouldn't be a need to run an expeditions project. One of the things that you find is that these program synthesis techniques work well at the small scale, but scaling program synthesis is quite a challenge. The search problems that you have to solve in order for these classical synthesis techniques to work are actually quite daunting. And for many of these success stories, they require very careful encoding of the space of possible programs that you consider and large amount of expertise in order to encode the problems in such a way that they will actually solve. So the big step forward that we're planning to make as part of this project is to bring together these program synthesis technologies with learning technologies to be able to get the best of both worlds. This by combining some of these techniques based on formal reasoning and some of these strengths of the programming languages and formal methods techniques that leverage modularity and data abstraction, and combining them with novel neural architectures, with numerical optimization, with better reasoning about probabilities and uncertainty, that you can actually do much better than what you can do individually with techniques coming from these two branches. And so that is really what we're after in this expeditions project. And so one of the key ingredients here and the core technical the technical core behind these developments is a set of new neurosymbolic reasoning techniques that are able to combine together these different styles of reasoning in different ways. So already we are seeing in the literature many different ways of combining neural and symbolic reasoning, many of those by people in this in this meeting, um, both PIs as well as many of our guests and collaborators. So you find, for example, very successful approaches that work by combining neural reasoning with logical reasoning in a pipeline. You start with a goal, you push that goal through a neural network to give you a higher level roadmap of the problem that you're trying to solve that then makes it more tractable for the program synthesis techniques to solve. You also see a lot of neural guided search techniques where a neural network guides the search for a program-like structure, for a program that will actually solve the task, with the advantage that you can now train this neural network on a corpus of problems to be able to solve problems in the same family more efficiently. We also see a very successful application of program extraction, where you start by training a neural network, but then you extract from that neural network a more programmatic representation that is more useful and that satisfies more of the goals that we want to satisfy for many of these scientific discovery tasks. And finally, we see a lot of efforts that are really trying to deeply intertwine neural networks with program-like structures in order to give you a lot of the advantages that we want. So to give you just one example of the kind of techniques that I'm talking about, and Swarat afterwards is actually going to describe many more of these examples, but just to give you a flavor of what we're looking for, I'm going to focus on this problem of program extraction. So in a very recent paper led by Jivan Inala, and that actually involved three of the PIs in this project, Osbert, Martin, and myself. We're looking at the problem of generating interpretable policies for autonomous agents, think drones, that are trying to communicate as part of fulfilling a task. And the idea is that each of these drones starts at some initial position and is trying to get to a predetermined final position, but it has to coordinate with all the other drones so as to avoid crashing into them or creating bottlenecks as they're going from one place to the other. So the high-level approach is that you have three policies. On the one hand, you have for every agent a policy that the agent uses to determine what messages it is going to send to other agents. And you also have a policy that on the receiving end is used to determine how to combine the messages from all of these different agents. And finally, based on those, the agent is taking some actions, right? And so this is something that you can actually do relatively efficiently using a transformer network, right? And you can even look at the matrix from this transformer network and figure out the communication pattern that is going to be induced by this network, which drones are paying attention to which other drones. The downside is that while at any given moment you can look at these matrix and get a sense of who is communicating with who, it's much harder to get a sense of why the network chose this particular communication pattern. What is the network actually trying to do? And it's also because it's difficult to tell exactly what it is that the network is trying to do. You can often end up with a communication pattern that involves too much communication, where too many drones are sending messages to too many other drones. So our approach instead is to define a custom domain-specific language that is able to describe these communication patterns so that we can now, from this transformer network that was learned by the system, push a program synthesizers to give you an interpretable program that is going to describe the communication. And so what we find is that if we compare the performance of the program compared to either a fixed communication pattern or a transformer network or a decision tree, we can see that in this graph, lower is better. Lower means that there's smaller loss. It means that you're able to communicate better. And so we can see that the transformer in general tends to do better than all the other approaches, but the program is not far behind, and it's certainly better than the fixed hard-coded communication pattern. Yet, if you look at the amount of communication that is taking place, how much communication is taking place for each one of these different goals for the desired agent, you find that the program, because you have a lot more control over the structure, you're able to enforce a much smaller amount of communication compared to many of the other techniques. And not only that, but you're able to get policies in the form of programs that you can actually interpret. You can actually tell that, oh, the rule that it is following is that it is choosing an agent in the direction of the goal, or that it's choosing to communicate with the closest agent to the current agent. We can actually plot, for example, the region that is defined by a predicate inside the program that says, I am trying to communicate with agents within this region that maximize a particular property. And so what we have is, by leveraging the structure of programs, we are able to get something interpretable and something that is more efficient to execute than the neural network. But at the same time, we're still leveraging the ability of the neural network itself to learn these policies efficiently and to actually give us a policy that works instead of having to synthesize that completely from scratch. Right. And so, as I said, you will see more discussion over the course of these 2 days about the style of techniques and some of the different places where they can be applied. But I wanted to give you a sense of the kind of ideas that we are talking about. Now, so we want to leverage neurosymbolic reasoning to solve these scientific problems. In order to ground our research, we decided to focus on 4 different domains where we felt there was a combination of need and opportunity in terms of what could be done and what could be accomplished with this kind of technique. So the 4 domains that make up our project, and you will be hearing talks around all of these different domains over the next 2 days. The first one is organic chemistry. Organic chemistry is a domain where some of the prior work of some of the PIs in this project has demonstrated enormous promise, but where we believe there's a lot of potential for the kind of neurosymbolic techniques that we are developing in this program to make a big difference. The next domain is RNA splicing, and I will explain a little bit more about what this is, but this is a really important domain in terms of understanding a number of diseases, as well as just understanding how cells work. And we also have the domain of cognitive science and behavioral modeling, and the domain of computer systems, where even though these are not natural systems, this is a domain where once you get to the complexity of modern computing systems, whether you're talking about data centers or whether you're talking about individual CPUs, you are now talking about a system that, where arguably it is easier to reason about in many ways by collecting data about it and by analyzing this data and building higher level models than by directly diving into the guts of how the system works. So, as I said, organic chemistry is an incredibly promising domain. One of the things that makes organic chemistry challenging is this enormous combinatorial space of possible molecules that you could potentially construct, where in many cases, just a tiny difference in a molecule can be the difference between it having, for example, a particular effect in the body and having a completely different effect, right? And one of the big questions that we have is, can we design molecules with desired properties? Or, for example, can we take a molecule that has a desired property, but also some undesirable ones, and eliminate the undesirable properties, but preserve the desirable ones? Can you make it less toxic or more potent or even easier to manufacture? Right? And again, in many cases, the challenge that you run into is that tiny differences in a molecule can lead to very large differences in its effect. The other challenge is RNA splicing. So back when I was taught biology in high school, I was taught this story about how you have these two strands of DNA that encode for a gene. And so then a piece of RNA is transcribed from that DNA, and then that piece of RNA travels to a ribosome, and out comes a protein, right? And one of the things that I learned in working on this proposal was that this picture was a lie, or more accurately, it was insufficiently precise, right? That in fact, in between this process of transcription and the point where you actually make a protein, the RNA actually has to be processed by the splicing machinery that is going to identify the parts of the RNA that actually have to be preserved and assemble together the piece of RNA that is actually going to be decoded into a protein. And this process of how this RNA is manipulated and spliced is crucial in understanding a number of genetic diseases, not only early onset Parkinson's and spinal muscular atrophy or ALS. It's also believed to play a role in some forms of cancer, for example. And so what we want is we want to be able to build models of these that take advantage of all the domain knowledge that everything that is known about how these processes work, but that can also leverage data, the large amounts of data that are available about these processes. Another domain that forms the core of this project is cognitive science. So there's a number of questions that we would like to ask about, for example, how do children acquire symbolic concepts, right? How do they learn to count? How do they acquire the rules of language? How do they come to understand the laws of physics, right? And so if you want to understand this process of acquiring symbolic concepts, then you want a notation that is able to capture rich concepts about the world, that is able to capture some of the symbolic knowledge. And so one of the hypothesis that has been advanced by many people in the cognitive science area, most notably Josh Tenenbaum, as well as Noah Goodman, who are part of our project, is that you can model some of these things through programs, and that by leveraging the machinery of program synthesis, you can potentially come to understand many of these processes, even compare the behavior of some of these program synthesizers with the behavior of actual human beings. Right? And finally, computer systems is another really important area for us. This is an area with enormous economic impact, where our ability to understand, for example, the performance characteristics of a computer system, and to understand it not just in order to make a simple correlation that says, for example, that gives you a black box prediction about the behavior of a particular program, but really understand it at a level that allows you to guide the optimization of a system based on this knowledge is something that can potentially transform the way we optimize synthesis. And so in the next couple of days, for example, you will be hearing from Michael Carvin about some of our efforts within the project related to this area. And finally, I'd like to welcome. I've seen that some of you are here today. People from our industrial advisory board. So these are people who, on the one hand, have significant expertise in this intersection of machine learning and formal methods, but who also can provide higher level insights about based on their perspective from industry. And so to end, I want to give a little bit of a summary of the first 6 months of our project. So as I mentioned before, the official kickoff meeting of this project was on April 1st. And so over these first 6 months, part of the focus has been on building up those teams and building up those relationships that are going to allow us to push this project forward for the duration of these efforts, right? So on the one hand, there has been research progress in all the different directions of this project, and you will be hearing from some of those advances over the course of the next few days. To me, one of the things that has been extremely valuable are these brand new collaborations that really could not have happened without these projects. So, for example, we are now running a group looking at RNA splicing that includes students from MIT, from UT, from Caltech, from Penn, and that includes students and faculty from both biology, machine learning, and formal methods. And so being able to come together and learn this common language and starting to build up the infrastructure that is necessary to push this research, assembling data sets and test beds, and really starting to try out different techniques on this problem has been extremely powerful and something that could not have happened without this project. And we're starting to see similar efforts around cognitive science, and we're bringing up to speed all the different domains that are part of this project to be able to really make these concentrated pushes around these different areas, and at the same time make sure that on the one hand the advances on the method side are informed by real hard problems in all of these different domains, and making sure that we are actually making progress with respect to these areas. We're also collaborating on a survey of neurosymbolic program synthesis that we expect to be an essential reading for all the students joining this project, and potentially the rest of the community who will be working in these problems. In terms of outreach, we have also started our monthly webinar series. We had our first talk in September, and we expect to continue with that. So you can find more information about this in our webpage. We also have started doing some of the outreach that was promised in the proposal. For example, we had a virtual booth at the ACM Tapia conference aimed at celebrating diversity in computing. And through our booth, we were actually able to collect CVs from 38 different students from underrepresented backgrounds. And we are looking to select a small number of students from that pool to and provide with summer research opportunities as part of this project. And here you can actually see how our virtual booth looks like. It's not quite the same as being there in real life, but as you can see from those numbers, it served its purpose. And so I want to wrap up to leave some time for questions and discussions, but I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. So if you have questions, probably the easiest thing is to write them on the chat.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm wondering, are there any plans to initiate startups based on these ideas in program synthesis and neurosymbolic learning?
Well, one of our goals is to have real world impact, right? And we are really interested in pushing these technologies to the point where they can be making the world a better place, right? And whether that is through startups or whether that is through industrial collaborations or whether it is by really just demonstrating the technology to the point where people across industry can pick it up and run with it. That that will be determined as the project goes along and based on the initiative of everybody in the group. But I would say that it is our goal as part of this project to really push the technology to practice, really demonstrate that we can move the needle on all of these problems that we have set up. Our dream outcome for this project is that by the time the project is over, we have demonstrated that a new class of techniques, and we have demonstrated their applicability in all of these problems to the point where when somebody is trying to solve problems in this domain, they reach first to this kind of approaches. So I see another question here. Can you formally define what neurosymbolic research is? So that is a very good question, and we've had a lot of discussions around this topic, where exactly where we draw the boundary of the work that we are trying to do. So for us, the thing that is key and the key novelty in this effort is the interaction between deep learning and between gradient optimization based learning techniques, and the combination of that with symbolic reasoning. So techniques that involve both the learning and the construction of neural networks or of other learning structures based on optimization, together with symbolic elements, whether they are in the form of programs or whether they are in the form of logical constraints, and where these programs or these logical constraints are themselves being learned, they're being constructed as part of this process. To us, that is the essence of the kind of techniques that we are targeting with this project.
So I'm wondering, how many startups are there as part of this expeditions project so far?
Well, we started 4 months ago, so none.
And how many startups do you have scheduled to join within the next year?
None.
Okay, that's good to know.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you expect any overlap between the different thrusts or strands?
Yes, that is a very good question. One of the things that is really critical for a project like this is that it doesn't devolve into five separate and independent efforts, each tackling a different domain.
Armando. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, so it's really critical that this doesn't devolve into independent efforts, each tackling a separate domain, but rather that there are synergies between the different efforts, and so we are already looking at many of these synergies, where, for example, the kind of techniques that were initially thought of as useful for analyzing computer systems. We are now looking at whether we can leverage them, for example, for understanding RNA splicing, or whether the infrastructure that is built up to do neurosymbolic synthesis in the context of cognitive science problems can actually be leveraged to understand computer systems. And we believe that it's really that cross-pollination between these different domains that is going to push us when developing the core technologies, the core reasoning technologies, to make sure that these technologies are general, that they're not just custom ad hoc solutions to individual problem domains, but rather that you really built up from these a science of neurosymbolic reasoning that allows you to bridge all of these different domains. So this question relates to one of the strengths of program synthesis techniques is the ability to produce multiple explanations for the observations, and the ability to actually reason about the relationships between these different observations. And so I think one of the questions here is whether or not you might lose that when you go to a combined model that includes neural components, whether you might lose the ability to do that. And you certainly could. And this is one of the things that is really crucial, to identify ways of doing that where you do not. In particular, for example, extraction techniques, like the one that I mentioned in passing, in relation to this drone work, where at the end of the process, you still find a single discrete program that satisfies your goal. So by using that kind of technique, you could actually potentially generate multiple different programs, introduce constraints to make sure that the different programs that you're generating are not just different ways of writing the same program. And then, based on that, leverage all the toolkit that we have from program analysis in order to actually find a program that you want. I think also bringing in probabilistic reasoning, where you can actually capture not just a single program, but a whole distribution over programs, where you can actually not just tell that there are these different solutions, but you can actually assign probabilities to them, can potentially allow you to reason even more effectively about these multiplicities of models. One question here from Osbert. So there is so what is the equivalent of ImageNet for these neurosymbolic methods? So one of the things that I see as a potentially very powerful outcome of this project is if we can develop the equivalent of ImageNet for many of these domains in order to make it easier for people with expertise in machine learning or with expertise at the intersection of machine learning and formal methods, where they can, in a low effort manner, they can try out their different algorithms, evaluate them, and measure them against state-of-the-art techniques, and in this way allow us to very quickly make progress in many of these domains. Every single one of the domains that we selected was selected partly based on the fact that there was a sense that there was a gradient of problems, from problems that are immediately tractable with the techniques we have today to problems that will really require fundamental advances in our capabilities, right? And the fact that there's enough to each one of these problems to move a research agenda forward for several years is critical, so that we're not just going to solve those problems in the first year and then move on. Yes, so there is a question here on what do I see as the key research questions that need to be answered on the core technical side. So one of the really big challenges is just the fact that there is this big mismatch between the style of reasoning that comes from what we like to call the synthesis 2.0 era of formal methods-based program synthesis techniques, where there's a strong emphasis on logic reasoning, there's strong emphasis on discrete combinatorial search, and the kind of optimization-based techniques that you have in deep learning. And so as we've worked more on this problem, we've gained much more of an understanding and much more of a respect of the challenges in bridging that gap, right? And it turns out there's a whole space of possibilities in terms of how to bring in the insights from the formal method side to help train neural networks better, as well as the ways in which we can take the insights from and the techniques from deep learning and bring them to bear in order to search for programs more efficiently. I think Swarat is going to talk in a lot more detail in the next talk on some of these technical challenges and some of these techniques that are being explored as part of this project. I'm going to take one last question. So there is a question of, is the machine learning side constrained only to neural networks, or do we envision that the primary alignment will be neural networks, but they might be augmented by other systems? We definitely don't want to constrain ourselves purely by neural networks. And in fact, we think there is very strong value in, for example, different techniques for Bayesian inference, or even things like genetic algorithms, as you point out. So what we're interested in here is to really build that synergy between the symbolic and our ability to reason symbolically at scale with machine learning broadly construed.